Welcome to UberCube, the place where we talk about Cube with refreshments. I'm your host, May, also known as Magic. You might notice something a little different. This time I am not joined by my other two co-hosts, but I am instead joined by my lovely guest, Kade, also known as Irrelevant.
Hi.
Hi. People might also know you as, the person who created the Avernus Cube.
Yeah, that is usually what people know me by if they know me for anything.
The unfortunate tragedy of being known for one cube, and it's like, I have other cubes,
I'm sure you can relate.
Yeah. But anyways, we are going to be talking about kind of the introductory steps or the sort of introductory concept of a commander cube. It's essentially the idea of taking a cube and taking everything that we enjoy about Commander and just kind of mashing them together. So it's kind of like a draftable Commander experience, if you will.
Yep, and that is my bread and butter. Most of my cubes are Commander cubes.
I actually used to have Brawl Cube that I really liked, but unfortunately I couldn't get my pod to really play it anymore. But there was like about a year or so that I was able to get people really involved with it. So I have a decent amount of experience. Not as much as you, but definitely more than Anthony and Stu.
Yeah, and I think it's really important to actually get people starting steps to figure out how to build a commander cube, because those starting steps are the hard part, and I think it's a great way to get into building cubes.
Yeah. One thing that I really appreciate about like commander cubes as a concept is that they tend to be a good introduction to cube from commander players, because we all know that commander is the biggest casual format. But being able to create a platform to, introduce that commander experience while also having that drafting and, I'll say, eliminating the rule zero conversation of commander decks to a degree is definitely a good thing.
How dare you? I still have rules. You can if you want.
We can if we want. Before we get into the conversation, though, we're going to do the thing that we always do here at UberCube and actually mention our drinks of choice. Kate, why don't you start us off by telling us what you're drinking?
Well, I have to work later today, so I'm actually drinking a store-brand orange seltzer. It's delicious.
Hey, sometimes just keeping it simple with a seltzer is good. I'm also keeping it simple and non-alcoholic today myself. Sorry, Anthony Stu, I know that you're shaking your fists in disappointment, but I'm actually being responsible and having some mint green tea.
No proper refreshments on this episode.
Yeah, so without further ado, let's get into it. I think that one of the most important things that people need to understand about Cube as a format is that it's not always just, how do I put it, 1 to 2 step like Vintage Cube is the best way I can put it, I suppose.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a very important sort of bias that I would like people to be able to get over, is this assumption that it's Vintage Cube or maybe unpowered Cube.
Yeah, and it's not that there's anything innately wrong with those formats, and I'm really glad that they exist, and they are a really good way that people can kind of get engaged with the community in terms of that type of Cube content. But that's not all that Cube is. And when we are trying to take it from the top-down approach of how can I take a commander experience and put it into a cube, it can be kind of a daunting process for somebody who's new to cubes. So, what would you say is one of the biggest obstacles people tend to have when putting commanders into cubes?
I think just getting that sort of starting point of figuring out even what you're going to do with the commanders, how you're going to get them to players, is often a big hurdle and a big indecision that people have, and they don't want to get it wrong. But my bit of advice for that is that there really isn't a wrong way, and I suppose I can talk more about that if you'd like.
Yeah, go off. We are literally here to talk about it.
All right. So I have experimented a lot of ways with how to get commanders into people's hands with cubes. I've done a whole bunch of different commander cubes with all sorts of different ways, and I've found that, honestly, most solutions work, but people are always just, hung up on not getting it wrong. But, you can do a pack at the start that is just commanders and have people pick their commanders at the start. And that has certain benefits. Like it lets people know going into it kind of more what their options are and feel a little more comfortable building around. You can put them into packs like they do in the Commander Legends drafts, where they have like 2 seeded per pack. Or you can just shuffle them in, and as long as you have a high enough density, that the big sticking point with that is that you kind of need more density, that will work absolutely fine. You can also get weirder and wilder with it. I have a cube that I'm working on where basically you rotisserie draft commanders after the end of the draft.
I actually really like the way that you do it for rotisserie drafting afterwards, because it kind of gives you an opportunity to pick your commander after you've picked your cards, rather than starting right off the gate with picking a commander and then forcing yourself into that lane.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's kind of the big benefit of something like that, is that it kind of sets the commander as a back burner thing for, first of all, focusing on what deck and what pieces come to you, and then you just pick the commander that actually makes sense, rather than locking in on one of a few options and kind of having to hope that the lane is open.
Yeah, like one of the approaches people did when they were having like that sort of commander pack strategy, if you will, where it's kind of like that separate pack that you draft at the beginning of the draft rather than at the end, was that they made it so that way you're trying to diversify the amount of options that you have from that initial pack. Because you're not just picking one commander or 2 commanders within the same similar color scheme. You're trying to pick commander cards that would all be like kind of good together, but also give you enough options into each of those colors. And that can be a pretty interesting approach to solving the how do we get commanders into players' hands.
It absolutely is. That's actually how my first cube, my main cube, operates. And I do try to stress to people beforehand that the idea is that you want diverse options that still have overlap, so that the cards that you pick can still go in each other's decks.
Right. And I think a big part of it, the approach to trying to figure out how to make commanders work in this, is figuring out how big your players' decks are going to be. So I tend to see 3 major ways that commander decks are sort of built in cube, but it's definitely not like a rigid thing. Heaven knows you have enough cubes that don't have very rigid deck accounts, but usually what I see from people are 40-card brawl decks, where it's kind of just, hey, what if we just took the bare bones essential of your drafting, but you also get to choose like a commander. It's still your 40-card draft, etc. You just get to pick one of the legendary creatures, so maybe 2 of the legendary creatures or backgrounds or whatever, and now you get to just play it in a much faster, kind of more aggressively centered than commander setting. Whether or not that's 1v1 or multiplayer free-for-all, that's really dependent on the curator. But after that, I would say is the 60-card commander, and that's where it's kind of more of the Commander Legends style drafting, I would say.
Yeah, that's always been a very popular format, but it got way more popular once Commander Legends came out and Wizards kind of canonized it. 60 cards is... Yeah, 60 cards is just
my unappreciated goat of...
Oh, no.
Not goat. Goat.
I know where you're going.
The unappreciated goat of Baldur's Gate.
Oh, okay. I thought you were about to go into
I was going with
third...
that?
No, I thought you were going to go into the third option for deck size, which is the full commitment. Yeah.
Yeah. Full commitment 100 cards was the last one I was going to mention. And I have mixed feelings about it myself, just because it tends to lengthen the process.
Yeah, it's a very neat idea, and I'm certainly not going to begrudge anyone for taking that commitment, but
yeah.
A 60 card draft is already a lot to get people to sit down for.
Yeah. And I feel like that's one of the bigger obstacles when it comes to introducing commander and draft as a concept. Of balancing your commander games can already be a task of balancing the time that people will want to invest into their games, etc. Adding the extra time into deck building and etc. up to 100 cards, that can be a big ask if you're just trying to do like a sit down and play just for one session type thing. Like, there are people that tend to make those 100-card draft-style commander decks as more of an event thing, where it's like the drafting, building process is the fun part to build those decks, but then they'll reuse those decks for, like, the next couple months or so.
Yeah, I feel like you kind of have to if you're going to do it that way, because otherwise it's kind of a massive waste. You're drafting 100 cards, and you're 100% not going to see the vast majority of those cards in your games.
Yeah, and it can be really daunting, especially when you're trying to get people that are already comfortable with Commander and etc. to sit down and try to play Draft, to be like, all right, not only are we going to dedicate the next hour or so, maybe if you're lucky hour or so, to just building your 100-card Commander deck, and then maybe if we aren't all tired by that point, start getting some games in. But
yeah, and depending on how you built the cube, those games could be exhaustingly long.
I don't feel like it's an unfair assessment to say that the deck size relative to how Commander works as a sort of sub-format in Draft tends to affect how fast your decks are going to function. Like, when I was working on my Storytime Cube, which was my own interpretation of Commander Brawl style of 40-card up to 60-card Commander decks, it was a very aggressive format, and even though there weren't, like, super powerful cards in there, like, you know, powered,
yeah,
it didn't matter because, like, you still have so many aggressive cards that get rewarded because there's just less to work with, and depending on how you try to set up the custom rules for that, I've seen people do it at 20 life, at 30 life, 40 life, and it really just depends.
Yeah, absolutely. There's a lot of knobs. Like, deck size is an important one. It definitely has a large effect on texture, but when we're talking about Commander cubes, there's about 12 billion knobs that you can adjust or not adjust, and that's
Right.
definitely another intimidating factor.
It can be very intimidating, but I think that getting past that intimidation is worth it. I think hopefully we can encourage people to take the opportunity to attempt to do this.
Oh, absolutely. And I also think that you can shortcut a lot of those decisions. Honestly, if you're kind of intimidated by making all those decisions, you can just start out and just kind of ape Commander Legends style. Say 60 cards, there is color identity, 40 starting life, and then run that for a while and figure out, is this what I want? Or do I want to make adjustments later? It'll still be a fun environment. It'll still be a fun exercise, and it's not like you have to throw it out if you don't like those decisions. You can always make them different later.
What's interesting is that when we're comparing the experience between Draft and Commander, again, trying to loop us back into the deck size versus speed and all these multiple facets of control that you have access to, when we're looking at the play experience that you get in Draft, it usually makes cards a lot better than they would be in other environments, versus Commander makes other cards better than in other environments. So trying to build that bridge of card quality is going to be a difficult challenge. Is there a particular set of advice that you would have for people in terms of card selection?
My advice for card selection is honestly to figure out your commanders first, because that kind of will narrow down your pool of where you're actually, of what, like, cards are relevant to your environment. Beyond that, I don't think it's that different ultimately from more broad, like, cube advice. You can just keep the power level where you would expect it from sort of Legacy. You can go with all those Legacy staples, and most of them still play more or less the same way that you expect them to.
Yeah, and I agree with you. The reason why I mentioned that question the way that I did was because I actually had another cube in mind that is not a Commander cube, but it was designed in a way that kind of re-encapsulates that Commander-esque feeling in terms of gameplay, where it's the Live the Dream cube. It's not a Commander cube, but what it tries to do is recreate that kind of Commander experience in a limited 1v1 situation.
Yeah, absolutely. And it very much like slows down the game a little bit to try to let you appreciate those cards that are kind of stereotypically commander. And
Right.
God, I adore that cube.
I also adore that cube. It's definitely been on my mind since I played it last year's CubeCon.
God, I wish I
And
got to.
yeah, it's a shame that it's not coming back this year, but that's okay.
There will
Maybe
be
one day I'll be
plenty.
able to play it again. My
I'm
point
fa-
is that when we're kind of taking that top-down approach of I'm trying to make the commander experience for Cube, the way that you can interpret that is entirely different between curator to curator, depending on what you're trying to formulate.
Yeah, absolutely. You can try to kind of capture that energy of Commander as it is today, or it's very popular for people to try to recapture the energy of an older era of Commander. I like to think that that's what I'm doing with my main cube, but that's not the only places that you can take it. You can try to recreate the energy of 40 card retail draft if you want. I mean, that's not that different from what the original Commander Legends did.
Right.
Could have
And
had
to be
maybe
clear,
some
like
improvement.
Commander Legend style drafting is like my favorite way to draft Commander.
Yeah, that's fair. I do like it. I try to be a little bit more creative, but to a certain
Oh,
extent,
definitely.
it's maybe getting more fancy than it needs to be.
Because like with Avernus, remind me of the rules and limitations of your Avernus cube, just for the people who don't know about it.
Oh boy, this is a thing to jump into. So, Avernus Cube is a very interesting commander cube where it is 100 starting life, 20 card deck size, which those two numbers may seem a little bit conflicted, but they're brought together by the fact that everyone starts with a copy of Descend into Avernus in play, which is just an enchantment that progressively over the course of turns deals more and more damage to each player and generates treasures equal to that damage that it's building. So the first turn cycle, each of them is dealing 2 damage and making 2 treasures, and that's symmetrical. So every player ends up making 8 treasures and taking 8 damage by the end of the first turn cycle. 16 more treasures, 16 more damage for the second turn cycle, 24 damage and 24 treasures for the third turn cycle. So the game accelerates a lot quicker. So the 20 card deck size is matched to the faster games, and the 100 life is
Right.
as well, it just doesn't sound like it. The way that commanders work in that environment is actually just that they get shuffled in like all the rest of the cards, because it's a relatively small cube and it doesn't take that many commanders to have enough density to get players the commanders that they need.
Right. There is a reason that I put you on the spot with the Avernus in particular, and it was because that when we're talking about deck size not being a static thing, the first thing that I think of is Avernus as an example, where by technicality it is a commander cube, but it has its own kind of minigame thing going on with its own rules and restrictions, and my point with bringing it up is to encourage people who are listening to experiment with the rules a little bit and be okay with playing around with the formula to make the experience around playing your commanders or playing around your things more fun. Like, Avernus is a very fast-paced environment. Hypothetically, you are not making a lot of turns, but you are all making a lot of game actions, and priority matters a lot in that environment.
Yeah, absolutely. And it definitely does do a good job of sort of emphasizing that energy of the card pool is whatever you kind of make it. And it doesn't even have
Right.
to emulate any other environment. God knows that cube is like nothing else.
No, it's really not. And that's why it's the perfect example of the complete corner case commander cube design here, where there is not a rigid way to introduce the concepts behind commander into your drafting, but doing it in a way that is, I would dare to say, fast enough pace that people can kind of get into the action and enjoy the commander part without taking away from the fun drafting portion.
Yeah, absolutely.
So, another thing that I think that we should talk about when it comes to designing commander cubes just in general is trying to avoid rails as much as possible, because it can be really easy to fall into this trap, if you will, that, oh, if I'm going to have, say, Jund aristocrats, right? And we all know how many, like, different kinds of aristocrats commanders exist, and they could all just go into the same deck just fine.
Mm-hmm.
To some extent, they are interchangeable, right?
Yeah.
But what's nice about packages like those is that you can overlap those token packages into aggro. You can overlap them into things like artifact synergies. It has ways to overlap into other things. When you have things that are a little less overlapping to a degree, like, say, let's take an extreme example like energy, right?
Sure.
If you wanted to introduce a commander that had energy into it, and you introduce this into your environment, how do you make that so the people that are drafting that particular archetype doesn't feel locked into that?
Yeah, and I think that there's a lot you can kind of do, even with those sort of linear strategies, as long as you're willing to commit a lot of design space in order to creating that overlap. But so my first bit of advice is to not really put in those sort of hyperlinear mechanics that aren't going to cross over with other things, just because you want players to have that mobility. But my second piece of advice is that you absolutely can, if you're willing to commit to the particular design space that you are talking about, because Magic is a big game. There is a lot of, even for more linear strategies and things that have smaller corner of Magic space, there's a lot of different cards that overlap into sort of secondary things. Like, I don't know why this is the thing that is coming to me, but you could have, I think it's Decoction Module. My first bit of advice is to not really go with those sort of linear commanders or linear mechanics that generally are like parasitic and have a sort of more limited card pool, in order to sort of make sure that everything has that overlap and everything has that ability to kind of pivot around and still keep your synergy pieces. My second bit of advice is that if you're going to put something in like that, and you can absolutely make it work, it needs to be kind of a core focus, and you need to be willing to commit a lot of space in your cube to make them work. And you want to keep an eye for the options in that space that foster overlap less kind of directly, that have ways of, like, maybe for the example of energy, that the overlap isn't in the energy part of the card, but they have other parts to them that are the overlap. Like, to pull out somewhat dorky example of a card, Decoction Module says that, I believe it's whenever a creature enters, it makes an energy. Yeah. So, but it also has another mode that is 4 mana to return a creature you control to your hand. And you can say that that's maybe cross support for Blink if your environment's slow enough.
Yeah.
And, like, lean into those cards that have sort of multiple different angles.
Yeah, and I feel the similar thing with, like, Animation Module as an example, where just, hey, whenever one or more +1/+1 counters are placed on a permanent you control, you can pay 1 if you do make a token. And that's kind of that overlap that a lot of these things are kind of looking for between counters and tokens and whatnot. But just like with the Decoction Module, we're also able to pay 3, tap it, and choose a counter on target permanent and give an additional counter, right? So, sure, it's not fantastic, but it can create overlap with other counter synergies in a way that feels good.
Yeah, absolutely. In general, I promote playing cards that have as many sort of different angles present on the card that you can take it as possible, because I think they encourage players to sort of rethink their deck on a card-by-card basis of, like, what direction can I sort of take this? And they get to look at their pool and realize that a lot of their cards actually support something else that they weren't even thinking of when they picked all of them, and they can sort of find a secondary angle to pivot into.
Yeah. And following our starting example card here, where I immediately think of how so many cards exist now that create that natural overlap, and one of the big ones was like modified being a keyword from Neon Dynasty.
Yeah.
So when I think of like Decoshin or animation module, like more often than not animation module, right? Then I can think of like Aki Emberkeeper, right? Where it's an enchantment creature goblin warrior. Whenever a non-token modified creature you control die, create a colorless spirit creature token, right? So it can overlap with those counter synergies, or it can overlap with like enchantments or equipment or whatnot. And having that overlap is such a good way to introduce diversity within your cube, to encourage lots of different commanders without making them feel like that they're stuck on rails.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that it promotes much better an idea of players feeling like they invented their deck rather than they were just following instructions. If there's a lot of these sort of modular parts that anyone could have picked up, it lets players feel a little bit more creative.
Go ahead. Yeah. Don't get me wrong. I don't feel that it is a bad idea to just take a bunch of commander decks that you enjoyed, put them all into a pile, and then say, here's my cube.
That's how I built my first cube. I don't feel like
that is a bad approach.
It's not. Honestly, it's a very reasonable way to actually get into the environment. It's how I did.
But just having those glue cards is important.
Yeah, absolutely. Eventually, when you're getting down to refining the cube, those glue cards end up making everything kind of play together a little bit better, rather than having everyone just kind of building the commander decks that were seeded into the environment in advance.
Right. And I think that that's the important thing to consider when you're building your first commander cube, is that you're not just trying to put the instruction manuals to one of the commander decks that you just kind of shoved in. It's more of creating a platform for people to figure out their own deck within your environment.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's what people like feeling like they're doing with Commander. And generally, I feel like when you're building a Commander cube, the idea is to recreate that energy and that appeal of Commander in a cube.
It's also interesting because we can get that kind of design from commanders themselves, too. And I feel like that it's one thing that is definitely improved with Magic as we've gotten into newer sets. Like, remember that Dominaria United, I think it was, where Ivy was introduced?
Yes, I do.
Ivy, the Gleeful Spell Thief.
That's correct. That is correct.
I love
that was Dominaria United. Ivy is great.
Yeah.
It's a very weird one.
She's such a weird card, but she's perfectly encapsulates what I mean by a modal commander fitting well into cube environment. So Ivy, Gleeful Spell Thief, is green and a blue for a fairy rogue 2/1 with flying. Whenever a player casts a spell that targets only a single creature other than Ivy, you may copy that spell targeting Ivy. This card is cool because you can make it Enchantress, you can make it Spellslinger, you can make it lots of different things. Mutate is a funny one. Funny ways that you can build Ivy beyond just Enchantress, just Spellslinger, whatnot. As opposed to, I would dare to say, a little bit more linear Feather, where Feather is just explicitly spells, instants, and sorceries that target.
Yeah, my first thought when I think of sort of straightforward linear commander is like something like Brago, where it's like, you're doing one thing. Yeah, right. Feather, Brago, it's just like you're looking for one subset of cards to care about, and those don't really lend as well to a cube environment.
Right. And it's not to say that they can't have a place in a cube, obviously, but understanding that we have so many options nowadays in terms of card quality that we don't have to make that the default.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I use Brago in my main cube, so maybe that was a little bit of a cell phone of an example. But absolutely, you can sort of make your sort of more marquee examples the ones that have the most flexibility in where they go. The general philosophy of my commander cubes in general and my main cube in specific is that the commanders should have sort of as much going on as possible, because it gives people as many different hooks to look at and think, this is the part of this card that I should be caring about.
Right.
When that's not necessarily going to be the same bit for each player. Basically, I picked the commanders that are the most sort of indicative of modern design sensibilities that people usually groan about. The textbooks.
Yeah. For better or for worse.
I'm a little bit of a radical in that I love my textbook cards because they are the most sort of fiddly, and they generally ask you to look at them and figure out exactly what you're doing with them.
If it makes you feel better, I'm also an apologist for some of those. Like, I still unironically really like dungeon cards, so I understand.
I mean, you're not going to get me arguing with dungeons. I think dungeons are awesome. But that, for me, leans back into sort of a love of spectacle. And I think spectacle is a great place to take your commander cube.
I think that when we are taking drafting into the concept behind Commander in terms of play patterns, there are some advantages that draft has over just bringing your Commander deck that I don't think really gets appreciated or talked about enough. Like, I particularly like that there's not really going to be surprise elements in people's decks. Like, everybody has access to the same cards that you passed on from your pack, and so on and so forth. It also, assuming that you are actually working to curate your environment, there's not like suddenly, oops, I win type situations of feel bads that can happen in just Commander.
Yeah, kind of goes back to that conversation at the very beginning of the podcast where we were talking about Rule Zero conversations and I was being a bit glib. But there is that nice, you don't have to sort of take on faith that the other person understands and means the same things as you do. When you're talking about like your power level. It kind of eliminates
that pre-game expectation setting between those four players. And we know how chaotic it can be with Commander just as a format.
Yeah, and it is nice to just kind of have those boundaries already locked in and set ahead of time. You can't accidentally violate the boundaries of the type of commander people are expecting to play, because the type of commander that people are expecting to play in any given cube environment are extremely rigid, because they're defined by what cards are in there.
Right. Like, I am not going to disrespect any cube curator, but last year, on the complete opposite end, where we have the Live the Dream cube of the cube that I really like to represent kind of the Commander-esque feeling, but in cube without actually being a Commander cube, to the opposite extreme, where it was very much you're picking commanders in a sort of draft environment, but it was built in a way that felt like it was trying to be CEDH, but it also wasn't allowed to be, where it was just like there was a bunch of vanilla creatures that didn't really do anything. And I'm not talking French vanilla, I'm talking like vanilla, where it's like, congratulations, you have a big dumb creature, but it doesn't matter because I just played Vile and some other oppressive cards way before you even get to the chance to participate in this game, right? And when you have things like partners and conspiracies and whatnot, and you're trying to lean into what are the most broken, fun things that we can introduce from like CEDH and drafting, I think that it can be a fun direction to go, so long as you commit to the bit.
Yeah, you have to be aware of the power level of the cards you're putting in. A lot of people are concerned about like not accidentally sort of breaking their environment by putting in cards that break the power level, and they want everything to be perfectly balanced. And I think to a certain extent you don't need to worry that much about that, but you do need to keep it in mind. You do need to not be trying to play your godsires in the same environment that you're running, I don't know, Yuriko the Tiger's Shadow. Although that's probably a bad example for Commander Cube.
I'll take a more extreme example of having the Vile Smasher along with a bunch of conspiracies, and then having, like, say, Colossal Dreadmaw in the pack. Not that Colossal Dreadmaw was there, but it felt like the equivalent, right?
Yeah, and that doesn't really jive with conspiracies because they're all broken.
Yeah, they're all broken. They
And
are
Colossal
meant to
Dread
be
Bow's
broken,
bad.
and if you are leaning into it, it can be a lot of fun. So long as that's what you're setting the expectation to be. If you're trying to set your expectation going into these designs that you're trying to recreate a certain facet of drafting or a certain facet of commander building, then make sure that you're committing to it.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think that's just generally good advice for cube building in general is know your power level, know your vibe that you're building, and you can play pretty much out anything as long as you know that it's within the range that you're going for.
Right. So, I have a bit of a question for you.
Sure.
Has there been a commander cube that you've played of somebody else's that has left you inspired or left you thinking about it in post in a way that's affected your commander environments?
So I haven't actually played that many other people's commander environments. I played a few at CubeCon. I played one, I couldn't remember the name of the environment or the creator, that really reminded me of my main cube. It had a very similar energy, so I didn't really take much away from that one. But one that comes to mind for this question is the Tiny Leaders Cube. I drafted that at CubeCon. I actually drafted that a couple weeks ago at Boston Cube Party. And I do really like that environment. I'm very bad at it, but I do like it. And it's very good at sort of translating the energy of powerful legacy decks focused on like very, very cheap and like efficient cards that lock together very tightly into Commander, where it doesn't actually feel like what you expect when you hear the name Commander Cube, because it's very fast, very powerful without actually like evoking CEDH. Because it's not combo, it's all on the ground creatures, and I think that's very neat, and I think that a very good energy to sort of foster. It also had a interesting take on color identity that I might take notes from for some projects in the future. I'm not sure. But the way that color identity worked in that environment is that color identity only applied to what basics you could pull out of the basic box. The cards in your deck could be whatever color you wanted. You could run non-basics that produce whatever color you want, but you are limited to only picking basic lands of your commander's color identity. So if you want to splash, you have to actually take the fixing to splash. And I think that's very interesting.
Yeah, I think that's neat. And I think that also leads into our sort of closing topic when we're going into this is when you're building your cube, how are you going to address the color identity restriction when it comes to commander versus drafting? Because when we're drafting things, it tends to be a lot more fluid. After all, 5-color good stuff is kind of an in-joke for a reason, right? But when we look at commander, unless you're drafting specifically that 5-color commander or playing specifically that 5-color commander, then that doesn't really come up often. Most people are around 2 to 3 colors, right?
Yeah, it depends greatly on what the designer is actually doing when they're picking out the commander pool.
I don't think that it needs to be a rigid thing where you're very strongly saying, nope, you can only draft the colors that you're intending to be playing with whatever commander or anything like that. It doesn't have to be something extreme like that. But on the other hand, it also doesn't have to be so loose where it's just like anything goes, just throw in all these basically commander cards into your thing and hope for the best, right?
Yeah.
There's room to play around.
I think that color identity is a very interesting sort of topic when it comes to building commander cubes. I don't think that there is a right answer on how to kind of address it. I think
I agree.
I think Gwen's Tiny Leaders Cube came to a very interesting middle ground between including color identity and not including color identity. I think it's a much more interesting question than a lot of people give it credit for. There are a lot of people who will tell you, well, just throw out color identity. No one likes color identity, which I don't think is true, but I've been told it before. And I think that's coming from a place that is very sincere, and I think that they have sort of something that they want out of it. And I think that can often be a correct choice. I think that that can make a very interesting cube where you don't have color identity. But I don't think it's an automatic decision. I think color identity definitely offers some very interesting things that can be useful. I think that it provides a little bit of a guardrail for sort of newer drafters where they don't have to think about that splashing. I have someone in my regular play group that actually prefers to draft my cubes that have color identity because it makes them feel a little bit more comfortable.
Yeah, I tend to like the restriction myself where I'm trying to explicitly look for a certain lane that's open and then just trying to grab whatever commanders, partners, backgrounds that I can that happen to fit it. And you can tend to solve that with cards like Prismatic Piper or the nameless one, or no, sorry, faceless one. I can speak. Where those are just cards that can act as glue for those important overlaps where it's just like, oh, I didn't actually end up with the legendary of this other thing. Here we go. Here is this the Prismatic Piper or the faceless one, right?
Yeah, that is absolutely an option. I think it's a little bit of a sort of clunkier option than it necessarily needs to be. Yeah, I wish the cards were a little better because I get that they want to sort of discourage people from actually playing them, but they're functionally non-existent. I don't think I've ever seen anyone in Commander Legends drafts use the Prismatic Piper or the Faceless one, maybe once, because people are just like violently trying not to, which makes it less of a functional choice and more of a player headspace choice. Even in the design of the original Commander Legends, when they were talking about the Prismatic Piper, they talked about putting it in as more of a thing to make players feel comfortable drafting rather than something that people actually did. Like they said in all of their testing, either none or maybe one time someone actually used a Prismatic Piper in all of the testing of the original Commander Legend.
I think that those cards are a good example of making things a little bit more comfortable rather than just solely relying on hard restriction. You're picking your commander and now you can only draft in these cards.
Yeah, and I think it gets people a little more willing to think about pivoting, even if it's not actually going to be the solution at the end of the day. It gets people to think, well, I'm safe pivoting here, and if I don't find it, I'll do a Prismatic Piper. When in reality, they're never going to actually play the Prismatic Piper. They're going to get the other thing later. But it makes them feel safer doing that. And I think that's that's not nothing. Maybe it sounds like I'm saying that Prismatic Piper is kind of useless for that reason. But no, there was a reason they put it in the original Commander Legends draft, even though no one in playtesting used it. And it's because that psychological effect is important.
Those cards would have been a lot more interesting if they were artifacts, but, we'll ignore that for the moment.
Well, hey, Faceless One is an enchantment, and I find that very interesting.
It is an enchantment. It makes it slightly more interesting.
Although that environment didn't really use that.
No, it did not. When it comes to color identity as a restriction of being like, all right, when you build your deck, you can only have the color identity cards of your commanders. It can be an interesting way to introduce that restriction, to introduce that form of creativity. But on the other end, it also allows you as the curator to play around with more rules that you might not have considered. Like there was a rule that I played around with for a bit where I just did not have enough partners at the time, and this was before Baldur's Gate. And my solution to it was all monocolored legendaries now have partner. And that was just a kind of cool way to work around that restriction that I had while also introducing more interesting card combinations that you wouldn't get in other environments. So be willing to play with the mold.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the reason partner was put into the original draft format was to give people that room to pivot, which is why that's honestly one of the most popular sort of custom rules for Commander Cubes. They're two rules in a very similar vein, and they're both basically the two most common things for me to see, and it's either everything monocolored has partner, or what I tend to do more of is everything that sounds like partner is partner. So choose a background, partner with, friends forever, all of those just count as regular partner, and you can mix them interchangeably. And both of them do the same sort of thing.
One of the things that I do think is interesting as we're getting a little close to where we're wanting to wrap up here, but I wanted to just make a quick mention of one of the big advantages that Cube has over just Commander, especially when you introduce it as a commander type format, is that we get access to like the uncards, where having an environment where we can play Frankie Peanuts is pretty funny.
Yeah, absolutely. Frankie Peanuts is a fun one. Infinity Elemental is a favorite of mine. Trigger Happy is another really fun one. There's a lot of really cool uncards. Actually, no, my personal favorite is How to Keep an Izzet Mage Busy, which is a spell that for one mana does nothing but put itself back in your hand. But all of these are very, very interesting and fun to play with cards that you never get to touch in regular Commander, because it's really hard to convince people to let you play with uncards.
And this is a place that we can kind of bypass that and add a new expectation. And
yeah, absolutely.
The reason why I mention this is because we actually get to introduce mechanics that are kind of exclusive to Draft that makes Commander more interesting. So like Booster Tutor is one of my favorites for just throwing into a cube completely out of nowhere without any other context of just, hey, can I fit in a Booster Tutor? Yes, I can. Let's throw it in.
Yeah, absolutely. I think Booster Tutor is probably the single most cubed uncard in existence. It's also kind of obscenely powerful. I don't think people respect that a Booster Tutor in whatever cube it's in is usually going to be one of the most powerful cards, because just getting not only a first pick, but a first pick that is specifically relevant to whatever board state you're in is just obscenely powerful for 1 mana.
Definitely. It is a black mana instant spell that you opened a quote-unquote sealed magic booster pack, reveal the cards, and put one of them into your hand. Now, in the context of Cube, you're essentially having an extra booster pack in your box that you get to give your players a selection from, rather than just opening a brand new pack of magic cards, right?
Yeah, or for some people, they have specific Booster Tutor packs where they're pre-constructed.
Exactly, and there's just so many fun ways you could build with that. Like, I'll also like give a little bit of soft credit for like cards like Stalking Tiger, where you just put that pack technically underneath Stalking Tiger, and then when you deal damage, you get to put that pack into your hand.
Yeah, or if you want to go into
go for it.
Or if you want to go into a particularly unhinged place, you can go with, I believe it's Assemble the Pack, which is a 7 mana.
Oh yeah, that's so unhinged.
7 mana black sorcery that you just open up a pack, and I believe you get every creature in it directly onto the battlefield. But they're all zombies. They're all black zombies. I believe that's what that card does. But it's a very silly card, and it can be obscenely broken.
It's a really funny card in the context of Cube, and it can create experiences that you do not get in other Draft formats or even in Commander. But when you bring those together, then it creates just a really fun experience and a unique experience that people just don't really get anywhere else. And I think that that's one of the big takeaways that I want to give people for this episode is don't be afraid to play around with Commander, like as a concept, because there is a lot of room for you to play around with and make it a very unique experience.
Yeah, my best advice for cube design just broadly is to be as playful as possible, because this is something you control. You can never screw it up long term. So just play with it. See what works, toss out what doesn't, and don't assume any rules that already exist have to exist. You could break everything. I mean, that's how Avernus gets here.
Oh, absolutely. And sometimes I just want to do it on purpose in the context of Commander Cubes. Like, one of my favorite uncards is Do It Your Seraph, which is 4 white, Cyborg Angel, 4/4. Whenever it attacks, you may search your library for an artifact card, exile it, and shuffle your library. It has the text box of each card exiled with Do It Your Seraph in addition to its own. That card is not innately, like, game-breaking or anything, like, in the context of modern-day Magic. But it does something that feels really unique that would be fun in a Commander deck, but I can't play it ever in a Commander deck, right?
Yeah. I mean, it's also probably a lot more broken in a constructed Commander deck where
definitely
get whatever is the best thing in any given situation, which is probably like Darksteel Forge.
I think that I almost want to compare it kind of like to a Merwelder in a way, where you clearly are taking a risk to build up that setup and then building your payoff. But like,
Yeah.
in the context of draft, like being able to pick this card and be like, all right, what artifact's going to go for with this? It feels
it's much
very
more unpredictable.
satisfying. Yeah. And that's the kind of experiences that you want to provide to your players in environments like these. And that's kind of the fun part of introducing Commander into Cube, where we get to break those rules a little bit.
Sure. I will say, I touched on it very briefly earlier, but when you are building your Commander pool for your cube, think a lot about how many colors you want decks to be, because if you're putting color identity into the environment, that's going to be the thing that defines it. And you don't have to sort of follow any particular script on that. You could have all monocolored commanders if you want. I don't know that I would necessarily think that that's going to build a great cube, but you can go wherever you kind of want with that. But yeah, think about it.
I believe the phrase is "you do you boo."
Something like that.
Why don't you go ahead and let people know where they can find you on Twitter or wherever else you want to be reached out on?
I mean, I don't really use social media very much.
In order to reach out to me, don't.
More or less. I have a Cube Cobra. It's irrelevant. IRRELEVERENT. But yeah, that's about it. I don't really keep much social media.
All right, and with that out of the way, let's go ahead and get into our closing notes here. So just a reminder for everybody that we are still promoting the Capital Cube Championship for 2024. It's coming up on Saturday, August 24th of 2024, obviously. So it's going to be a twice-a-year thing, 64 players. It's a charity event hosted in Brooklyn, New York. All the profits will be donated to UNRWA, forgive me for butchering it. It's an aid organization supporting Palestinian refugees, and further details can be found in the show notes or on the ticket forms. It can be found through the link of upkeepnewyork.com. I got there.
And you can probably see me there. It's not finalized, but I'm probably going to be there.
I'd also like to take a moment to thank all of our Patreons for all of your support. We appreciate you very much. Thank you all for supporting us, and just to remind you that we do have a Facebook drafting page. You can find it under MTGCube under groups at facebook.com. You can also find us at Twitter at UberCubeMTGPod. You can reach us at UberCubeMTGPodCast at gmail.com. If you ever want to just send us a message, email, want to yell at me for my bad opinions, then, feel free to send us an email. We always appreciate the feedback. You can always find our link on Discord at #UberCube. It should be working now, we hope. Without further ado, we're going to say the thing that we always say here at UberCube. Happy cubing!